Hi, today I have with me best-selling author Shawn Levy. Shawn has written many books, but the one I want to talk to him today is about the Rat Pack Confidential. Hi, Shawn. How are you?
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. I have been looking forward to talking to you so much because I could not put this book down. And my compliments to you is the fact that I've read so many books and watched so many videos that I didn't think I didn't know anything until I read this book. So,
oh, golly.
I thought I knew it all. I was like, okay, well, let's see what I don't know. And I started taking notes, and I got 5 pages in, I stopped. I was like, okay, I don't know a lot. I need to rethink my knowledge about, the Rat Pack and everything that was going on during that time. And that's what I loved the most was like, it wasn't just about them, but the way you related it to history during that time. So I felt like I was there, participating in it. And, so thank you so much for talking with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And, I don't even know where to begin because I'm, I can actually talk to you about this, but I have to say that I didn't ever individuate them as much, even though I've read individual books on them. I feel like I know them better as how they fit into the group of the Rat Pack. I didn't understand the personalities and how different they were. I mean, I think everybody can kind of say, okay, they were a little different, but like inherently different they were, and how it worked, like how they got together and how it worked. It's just, it's an amazing story, and you did such a good job with that. So,
Well, thank you.
It was, so my big question for you is there anything you learned writing the book? Like, I'm sure
God,
you...
tons.
Yes?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
There were stories that you hadn't heard.
Yeah, I was lucky when I worked on the book. It was it was published in 1998. It was published about about a month before Frank Sinatra died.
Oh, wow.
And so he was alive when I wrote it, not interested in participating and probably too ill to participate. But what was still extant when I was working was the Sands Hotel. And I stayed at the Sands Hotel the last week that they had guests.
Wow.
Pardon me, I've got a frog in my throat.
That's okay.
Oh, awful. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
So the last week the Sands had anyone staying there, I was on the property, and the publicist, who was a young guy but knew all the old timers in the building, he had no work to do, and he took me around and introduced me to people, probably 6 or 10 people who I spoke to that week who'd been at the hotel since it opened. They had worked 40 years. And they filled in the stories. It's very easy to find the facts of a famous person's life and, put together a chronology. And I think that's what you're talking about when you say you read an individual book about someone and sort of the basics, the hardware, the firmware of their life. But by talking to people who were on the scene for all those decades, I was able to fill in the backgrounds. Get a sense of what Vegas was like in the 50s, just for an ordinary person, not for a superstar. The daily life, the lack of grocery stores or buses or, things you and I might not think to ask. These people were just saying, oh, back in those days, if you were walking along with a grocery bag, someone would stop and pick you up. They wouldn't even ask.
Wow.
Little things like that. So that helped me fill in quite a bit of knowledge I didn't have about what the world was like. One of the things I've always said about that book is on the jacket is the famous picture of the 5 members of the Rat Pack standing in front of the Sands. And I wanted the book to fill in the picture around them, to show what that world was like, who was there, what the days were like, what life was like on the Strip back in 1960. So all of that was news to me. And then, because I was looking at the Rat Pack as the nexus, it was like I was foregrounding something that in other biographies of Frank or Dean Martin or John Kennedy or Sam Giancana, the Chicago mobster, it was a moment in those books. For me, it was the whole book. So once you make that decision to say, okay, I'm interested in the Rat Pack era and not in the life of Peter Lawford or the life of Sammy Davis Jr., then everything that you learn about them takes on a slightly different hue. You know, sometimes it's not important to me when Sammy's dad died, which was a big thing in his life, but wasn't pertinent to the Rat Pack. So once you make that decision, then you start seeing connections between things, and you start seeing other avenues of research, and you know, it just gives you a different perspective. And I think that was really important in making that book different from other books about those guys.
Yes, and I have to say, for anybody out there who watches the YouTube documentaries on the Rat Pack, that's why I felt like I knew so much, but you have to read this book because it really doesn't give you the detail. And this book is not a large book. You know, when I got it, I was like, okay, you know, it's going to be an easy read. It was not. It was like, oh my gosh, so much is packed into this book. So much stuff that, you know, like you said, like that took me back there to that time. That wasn't just about, because I had read enough books about JFK and, you know, the different stars that were in here. I've read enough that I thought that I knew, but I think, you know, I was, before this interview, I was thinking, like, what would I say? Like, what hit me the most about it? And I think what I learned the most was like who Joey Bishop, like how he fit in, because I never really got a sense of exactly how he fit in with them, because he wasn't a singer per se, wasn't, you know, so that was awesome. I loved the chapters on him. And Peter Lawford, my sympathy towards Peter Lawford, you know, what a tragic, you know, I read a lot of Kennedy books, you know, like 10 years ago. I was really into reading Kennedy books, and those books did nothing to portray who Peter Lawford was, you know, like I learned now.
No,
you know,
he really is. I mean, you know, it's hard to think about somebody who was a Hollywood star and drove Porsches and owned restaurants and had, you know, a bunch of wives. It's hard to think, oh, what a pathetic figure. But he really was. From the time he was a boy until his death, you know, even when he was at the height of his career and his power, really, as a brother-in-law to the President of the United States, he was always sort of just hanging on, you know, and he knew it. Like, he may have projected an air of confidence and savoir-faire, but he was actually a very lonely, desperate, insecure character, and this episode with the Rat Pack pretty much was the end of him. He never really recovered from you know, it's the story of flying too close to the sun with wax wings. You know, he I felt like crying when I wrote about his death.
Oh, and just the fact that he, you know, I never understood. Okay, you know, when I was reading the Kennedy book, you're like, okay, Pat Kennedy marries Peter Lawford. Like, how is that a real? But the way you described it was like she did contribute something to him, you know, that he hadn't gotten from some of the Hollywood starlets, and you know, there was something on his side. It wasn't just something on her side that was to be gained. But then, you know, he never fitting in with Bobby and John, and you know, like he wanted to fit in, and it seemed as though like he never could fit in with them. You know, they didn't respect him enough. I don't know. I mean, that's what I was getting. There was like a lack of respect for him. They kind of used him for what they needed him for.
Yeah, that's exactly right. He, you know, in ways, I mean, they weren't kindly to him, and that I fault them for. But you know, he was not a heavyweight. He was not. He didn't. What he brought to the table was, you know, for a while in the 40s when he first came to Hollywood, he was known as America's guest because he was like a Cato Kalin figure. He just showed up. He was living in people's guest houses all over Southern California, and the first time he showed up to meet the Kennedy family, he was wearing red socks, and Joe Kennedy, the father, never got over that. Like, what sort of a man wears red socks?
Right.
And there's a famous picture of Jack Kennedy and Peter Lawford on a yacht, and Jack is sort of very carefully listening, and Peter is saying something, and it was hanging in the White House, and Peter was in the White House one day and said, "Oh, I'm so pleased you have this picture up." And Jack said, "Yeah, the funny thing about that picture, it gives a mistaken impression that I actually care what you have to say."
Ooh.
I mean, he said it in a way that you would say it to a brother or a brother-in-law, but there was more truth in the joke than not.
Right.
And, that's who he was. As soon as his usefulness to Sinatra had expired, then Sinatra dumped him. As soon as Jack Kennedy was dead, the Kennedy family dumped him, because Jack was his main guy in the family, and he was, like several of these men, he was completely unfaithful to his wife. So they were going to divorce, and then there was the assassination, so they put off the divorce for another year just to, spread the bad news, over time. But he really was sort of discarded by all the powerful people around him, and he wandered around in his life for the last 15 years or so like a ghost. He was a terrible drug addict. He had a couple more wives. It was really an awful climax.
For something of like what he could have been, as a movie star and as a Kennedy, it seems like that, he just never. It was like he tried to make Frank happy, but then the Ava thing happens, and it just, I don't know. It's a very bizarre, set of circumstances for him. I think always missed opportunities.
He fell into a couple of good moments, and it's sort of like being in a casino and having extraordinary luck twice, and then gambling as if you weren't lucky, but you actually did that out of skill, and you know what you're doing, and you don't.
And you don't, right?
And and there was a stage production of Rat Pack Confidential in London, and I had several long talks with the fellow who played Peter Lawford, and he was really, sort of invested in the role and felt so bad for the guy, and I'm a film critic by daily trade, and I felt like this guy is maybe a little too sympathetic to this character, because he's not going to be able to play the swagger. You think he's just pathetic, but as I say, this guy was married to a Kennedy. He palled around with Sinatra. He drove Porsches. He was with beautiful women his whole life. It's funny that we wind up being sympathetic for him, but in fact, he lived on top of the world for quite a long time as well.
Right, like he did have his moments of, that you don't have to feel, that bad for him. But I did have a question as to, I felt like when you talked about the JFK assassination, you didn't get into any of the mob stuff that other writers and documentaries have done. Did you avoid that on purpose? Did you just not think it was relevant? Like you just didn't want it? Because not that can't be its own thing, but I felt like, because I just read a book on Frank, so coming off one of his books, I was like, oh, that's interesting. I was wondering, what your thoughts were when you were writing this, about that whole scene.
Well, I was from the time I was a boy, I was fascinated with Kennedy assassination stuff, and to this day, I'm still drawn to it whenever I see a new book, or you're flipping channels late at night. It seems there's always a documentary somewhere about the Kennedy assassination, and I wind up watching it. This book, it was. I had originally talked about it quite a bit, and my editor and I came to agreement. He said, "This stuff is getting in the way. You're turning the camera too far away from that group of five for too long." And, it was the second book I wrote. And it was the book on which I learned, pacing and when a reader gets to a certain portion of the book, when you're about 2/3 of the way through, and you know this because you have the book in your hand, and you can see, well, I've only got this much left. It's actually not a great idea to start a whole new line of inquiry, a whole new subject matter. So just tactically as a writer, it's not a great idea to introduce a big theme late in the book. And the second thing is that there's so much stuff about the Kennedy assassination to go into, and if you say, okay, I'm going to go with theory A, then you have to, offer qualifications as to why you don't agree with the people who debunk theory A, and actually I take theory A, subset B, section 7. It's such a field of scholarship in and of itself that you can't do it lightly. You have to really get into it. And the combination of it being not really about the Rat Pack, about it coming very late in the narrative, and then simply how much you have to do it right, meant that I had to do it, in just brush strokes. And I think that suited this book. I do too. I really do. I would, like I said, when I'm reading it, I was like, oh, that's interesting. Because I kept waiting for it in a weird way. Like I thought, well, maybe it's going to come up later, but then when it didn't, I was like, well, there's got to be a reason. And I do think that it would have taken it in a whole different, with just Frank, would have taken it a whole other story, because I don't know that the other had so much to do with it anyway, right? Right, unless I can put Frank in Dallas on that day, which I can't. And in fact, the story I wind up telling is that the day of the assassination, the Sinatra and Dean and Sammy were on the set of Robin and the Seven Hoods at the Warner Brothers lot in Burbank, and at USC they had the production files for that film. And I was able actually to see the workflow of that day. Someone writes down, we took shot 17 23 times, and then we broke for lunch. And it tells exactly what happened. They were working. They got the news that the president had been shot. They took a lunch break, and then they went back to work.
That's just crazy. When I read that, I was just like, that is just, I didn't know that part. I actually
no one did.
I actually had never read that story. So
nobody before me had gone to those files and looked at that day's work. There were stories about what happened, and people told stories. Sammy Davis Jr. told stories about it, but I was looking at like what the unit production manager employed by Jack Warner on the set wrote down everything that happened, and I trusted that better than anyone's memory 20 years later of what it was like for them. Because that guy's job was to get that right.
Exactly. And you said, Sammy always changed history anyway. Like, even though he would say that he had a memory of it, it never came out. The same story twice. So this is something you find in biography. If you get a chance to talk to your subject and they're 75 years old and you're asking them about their childhood, this is a true memory, but is it the truth? Is it what happened, or is it, I think you and I have had experiences where we remember something, we're sure, and then someone shows us a picture or says, no, I was there, it was different, and you're left wondering, do I remember it? And that's fine in real life, but when you're trying to nail it in a biography, if you can find the sources you can find closer to the day of the events are the ones to trust. Yes, and that's, like I said, I learned so many more stories just like that. And then I was wondering, like, what led you to want to write the book on them? Did you always have, were you a fan? Were you a fan of them, of the music, of the shows, you say in the beginning, which I love, is that, you wanted to thank your mother for taking you to a show in utero. So,
Yeah. I grew up my mom and dad were, they weren't criminally affiliated or terribly swank, but they were rat packy. They were of that generation that would have loved to be in Vegas to watch those shows. And the household was filled with their music, Sinatra and, Lena Horne, Billie Holiday, Dean Martin, the music of that era, the Great American Songbook, and the big band singers who became solo acts. And my first book was on Jerry Lewis.
Yes, I saw that.
And I wanted to write a book about Sammy Davis Jr. Mm-hmm. Pardon me, who I still think of as this sort of titanic figure, like a Jackie Robinson type, pioneer in showbiz. And I did some research, and I was ready to write a book on Sammy Davis Jr. and had a conversation with my agent and said, I want to do Sammy Davis Jr. And he said, who cares? And I knew there would be some resistance somehow, so I was prepared with my pitch, my speech about Sammy Davis Jr. And before I could get started, my agent said, what about the whole Rat Pack? And literally the entire book, as it is currently written, popped into my head instantly.
Wow.
I knew exactly what that book would look like.
Wow.
So, I was sniffing around the general area, but it wasn't until my agent pointed out that, that would be a better book, and he was right, that I chose to do the Rat Pack. And then it was a question of paring it down. How much biography do you give everybody? There's volumes, there's bookcases on Sinatra, there's libraries on the Kennedys, on Las Vegas. So I decided to start as if I didn't know anything. And I went to Vegas. I worked at the Sands. I worked at some of the Sands. During one of the renovations of the hotel, they emptied out all the archives, all the paper. And that quite a bit of it wound up at UNLV, the University of Nevada at Las Vegas. And I was able to just walk in and request to see, the Sands history files. And I found great stuff in there, So by pretending I didn't know anything, I actually found stuff.
And it was very interesting to me is that I didn't know, even as much as I've watched and read about Frank, I didn't know the detail of his departure from the Sands. That was very interesting. It's like, well, people have brushed over it in a certain way that it ended bad, but I had no idea, how bad and exactly what happened when he, parted ways with the Sands, and it was a very interesting story. But that Sammy kept working there, correct?
Yeah, I believe Sammy stayed on for a little while. Sammy was an extremely loyal guy. Sammy had grown up an only child, as had Frank. And Sammy's parents were show people, and they were constantly on the road. So I think whenever Sammy found a stable situation, he latched onto it. And the Sands was good to him. They broke a lot of the horrible Jim Crow policies of Las Vegas in order to accommodate Sammy, and he stuck with them as a result, even when Dean and Frank had moved on.
Right. Why do you think, because when I was looking for books on Sammy, because I love his music, I've really gotten to enjoy his stuff even more recently, but why do you think he has his own autobiography, but besides that, there are not that many books on him? Is there, when your editor said, so what? It's like, was there, I was trying to figure out, why wasn't he Michael Jackson? Why wasn't he that guy? He was just talented.
I think he was. It's he had that sort of fame in the 50s and 60s, but then he became this sort of, people remembered him as this, person on Johnny Carson who was, with a phony laugh, slapping his legs when a guy makes a small joke. And, when he moved into more modern sounding music, his instincts as a showman weren't quite as sharp as they were when he was doing music of his era. So, for example, during the age of the Beatles and the Stones and the coming of psychedelic rock, Sammy got into contemporary music, but his favorite band was Blood, Sweat, and Tears, which is a nice band, but it's not the same sort of thing you get when you decide you're going to be like the Beatles.
Right.
So he just seemed a little off, and he became sort of like a showbiz joke. And
I was just going to say that. Was it like a joke? Did it become a joke? I was just thinking that. Is that what happened?
Yeah. Billy Crystal would literally imitated him in blackface.
Oh my gosh, I forgot about that. That's right. Yes.
And it's late Sammy that he's doing, and then when you go back and you listen to his music, and you hear there's an amazing recording of him singing "Begin the Beguine," the Cole Porter song, with only a conga drum as the accompaniment, and it's just hair raising. I mean the interpretation, the voice. This guy had like a 3-octave range.
Oh my God! That's what I was thinking. It's like I don't know that it's been as appreciated. I know I didn't until I started listening to the stuff they had on YouTube. But now I just set it to his channel and I can listen to him and I'm like, listen to that voice. It's crazy.
It was remarkable. The deep notes he could hit were like, this guy was like 5'4". The notes he hit were like in the sub basement. And lost, of course, before the era of YouTube or even VHS, there was that time where if you didn't see something, you missed it. And so much of Sammy's talent was revealed in performance. His dancing, which was, considered the equal of any tap dancer in showbiz, Fred Astaire, Gene Kelly, name your favorite, the Nicholas brothers. Sammy was considered a peer of them as a dancer, but you couldn't see that. So unless you had seen him in performance or happened to see the TV show he was performing on, you didn't catch it. He had no movie career to speak of. He was in 5 or 6 pictures, and most of them were as Rat Pack sidekicks, maybe 20 pictures. And he, as an individual artist on TV, he had his own show once or twice, but it never clicked. So he had been neglected. And, I don't understand the resistance to him at the time because, as I say, I knew it was coming and I prepared to counteract the argument, who cares?
Right.
But there have been a couple of biographies since I wrote. Will Hayes, I believe it is, a guy who used to write for the Washington Post, wrote a very good book about Sammy Davis Jr. And I think he finally got his due, but I still think that most people think of Sammy, they don't think of this incredibly talented, incredibly hip guy from the 50s. They think of someone in a Nehru jacket singing the Candyman on the Johnny Carson show, and that's not hip.
Well, what I realized watching his videos was that if anybody was watching him dance, to me, it was Michael Jackson. Like, there were so many moves that Sammy was doing, 15 years before Michael Jackson came along that I was like, oh my gosh, not that you can't see some James Brown and, some other dancers, but I definitely see a lot of, growing up with Michael Jackson. I'm like, okay, he was watching Sammy,
Oh, and he said so. Yeah, Michael admitted it. In fact, there was a special on TV it must have been in the 80s, and it was celebrating Sammy Davis Jr.'s some milestone in his career, 50 years in showbiz, because this guy literally grew up on stage. I mean, his parents were both show people, and he was on stage from the time he was about 3.
Right.
And Sammy danced, and Michael Jackson was on the show, and
nice. I have to look that up.
As I remember, Gregory Hines, another great dancer, when Sammy finished his solo piece, just came out onto the stage and bent down and kissed Sammy's feet.
Wow. That's like when you said that. That's crazy.
The people who knew dancing and knew showbiz knew exactly where Sammy's place was. He had the respect of Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly, the great Hollywood dancers. And for that matter, I think this story is in Rat Pack Confidential. When Sammy first appeared in L.A. and was just killing people, he was performing at Ciro's on the Sunset Strip with his father and his uncle. The old showbiz people who came out, I'm talking about like Al Jolson, Groucho Marx, Rudy Vallee, they said this kid is the best all-around entertainer there's ever been. This is when he, before his auto accident, he lost his eye. I mean, really early on when he was like 20. People just praised him to the moon. And for someone like Groucho Marx to tell Al Jolson, this kid is a better performer than you, you're now talking about the performer of the century. Right. And Michael Jackson is the only person who really compares, as the all-round thing. And Michael also didn't have much of a movie or TV career. He had a bigger recording career than Sammy ever had.
Right, exactly. And then, before we finish, we have to talk about Dean a little bit because I don't want to neglect Dean. But
Dean from Pennsylvania.
Dean from wait, what's the name of that town?
Steubenville. Right. Not from Ohio.
No, Ohio, but right over the border because
very close.
I've driven through there. But what I learned about Dean was not that I knew stuff about, him and Jerry Lewis and everything, but what impressed me the most was what I read in your book was like he ended up being, even though he seemed like he was a background, to Frank and everything, it's like the money that he ended up having, the career that he had, kind of like he didn't owe Frank. That's
no,
how
he didn't.
That was my impression of reading this. As a reader, I was like, oh, he didn't really owe Frank, anything, and he didn't act like he did. I was like, it was very interesting take on his relationship with Frank, and and how he could walk out. I mean, like he did in the 80s, and say, yeah, I'm not doing this, and he didn't feel, he was his own man. That's what I'm trying to say. And he always was. Dean had two partners in showbiz, Jerry Lewis and Frank Sinatra, and they were both only children, emotionally needy guys from northern New Jersey. It's a weird coincidence, but I think it's telling. I never thought. Yes, it is telling.
I think Jerry latched on to Dean and Frank latched on to Dean because Dean had this air of not needing either one of them. And that's an attractive thing. Someone not, devoted to you, someone you need to please to keep the attention of, can actually be attractive. Dean, he had a solo movie career that was bigger than anyone could have predicted. He made westerns, he made the Matt Helm movies. And the biggest thing he did was the Dean Martin Show on NBC, which ran for years and was in the top 10 on Nielsen's for years.
Which I didn't know.
Fortunes.
I did not know. I didn't know that. Yeah, that's another thing I read in your book. I'm like, how did I miss that before? I had no idea that it ran for 10 years.
Yeah, and then all those celebrity roasts and one of the dirty secrets of Hollywood is the single most profitable venture for anyone is a hit TV show, not a hit movie. A movie comes out once, maybe you have a sequel, maybe you have a franchise, but if you have a hit TV show, it's on every week for years, and it's in reruns and syndication, and that money stream never dries up. And Dean was very conservative. Frank would buy restaurants and hotels and airplanes, and Frank had more money than Dean. But Dean bought land and he bought NBC stock. That was all he bought. And those things never went down in value. He made fortunes. But he was also characteristically his own man. My favorite Dean Martin story of all time is that there was a dinner party at his house, and there was a knock at the door, and it was the police. And they said, we've had a complaint of noise. And he lived on an estate in Bel Air, and there were no neighbors close enough to complain about noise. And they figured out when they were saying, who complained, they looked around, and Dean wasn't there. Dean had gone upstairs to his bedroom to watch TV, and when he wanted the guests to leave, he called the cops.
Yeah, and he was afraid, to do that. He was afraid to be alone. Like Frank, needed people, and Dean would go off and do that, right?
Yeah. Frank, guys, Frank would be the only one awake, but everyone would be sticking by his side, because they wanted to be around him, and Frank needed a crowd, and Jerry Lewis needed a crowd. Dean was fine alone.
Right.
And when he wanted his house empty, he called the cops.
That's hysterical. That's a great story.
I just love that.
Yeah,
I don't have the guts to do that, but I wish I did.
I know. And I loved it, when you were telling the different stories of the investments that Frank made, it seemed to me like every time he needed money, he'd go to Dean, but Dean would give him, like a 1% or something. He'd be like, but Dean, I'm doing this. Oh, here's 1%.
Yeah.
Or, but it seemed like he always did go to Dean, so Dean did take care of his money well, it seemed like. Frank was the one always trying to, open this, do this, always trying to do something.
They were both listed as owners of the Sands Hotel, partial owners. I think Frank had 5% of the hotel and Dean had 2%. But in fact, they never earned a dime of that. That was their shares were covers for mob money. You couldn't put Chicago mob on the list of owners, but you could put people who just transferred their money, never saw the money, and it would go to Chicago. And Frank actually thought that he was going to get rich on owning a hotel, and Dean knew, growing up in a crooked town, that he wasn't going to see a penny of this stuff. So, Frank might have relied on it, but Dean knew that he would never see it, and that's a big worldview difference between these guys. Sinatra was an idealist and a striver, and Dean was like, I can't believe they're paying me to do this. When does it end? I want to go golf, and he got to the point where he wasn't even showing up for rehearsals for his own TV show. He would come in on Sunday evening. They would tape for Thursday, and, remarkably, part of the charm that America loved was the fact that he looked like he didn't know what was going on or care.
Because he can pull that off so well. And, that's just kind of his thing. And what did you think of his relationship with Sammy? To me, it seemed like they had a kind of bond. Well, when I watched especially when I watched some of the performances on YouTube, they seem like they're kind of close in a different way.
Yeah. Frank as a performer is sort of like Olympian. I mean, he's just coming from another level as a singer, and his care for the craft of music was so deep. People don't know that Frank conducted music. He's put out recordings of classical and jazz music on which he was the conductor and not a singer. And he was known in the circles of studio musicians and the musicians that he worked with in orchestras as having an incredible ear. He could find the one bad note that someone played in a score that the conductor had missed. So when he sang, it was like a big deal. But Frank and Sammy, for them, singing was part of an overall thing. It was, part of their shtick, really. And yeah, they could both sing beautifully, and when they wanted to, they could draw attention and be serious the way Frank was. But when they were together and doing Rat Pack things, they were slap happy, and they were kids together, and, they were both funny. And Frank was not funny.
Yeah,
Frank did humor, but it wasn't. He didn't have a funny bone in him.
I'm not sure if I read it in your book or if I saw it on YouTube, but there was a famous story that Frank says to Dean, "Well, I want to be the funny guy tonight," and then Dean's like, "Okay, well, I'll take your lines, you take my lines," and then he still didn't get because he knew
Dean got the laughs.
Dean
got the laughs with the straight lines, and Frank couldn't get the laughs with the punchline.
Right.
And that's a true story, and that tells you everything. Jerry Lewis, who was in love with Dean Martin, told me that Dean was funny in his bones, and it's true. some of the things that Dean did. For instance, people these days are I think rightly suspicious of the song "Baby It's Cold Outside." You know, it's got this weird vibe of like, yeah, keep drinking while I rape you. You know, and
right.
Yeah. So Dean, who was known in showbiz as King Lear with 2 E's, because you know there was such an air of licentiousness and you know frank sexual desire in his singing. He does "Baby It's Cold Outside," and go give a listen to it because there's nothing sinister about it. He sounds like he's laughing at the words. It's an up-tempo recording, and the woman's part is sung by a chorus. You know, and
I was going to just ask you who the woman's part was, but okay.
It's like 3 anonymous capital singers, and you know, which also, you know, is not the ideal situation for a date rape. You know, it's
right.
You can't date rape 3 women, and Dean somehow manages to make this creepy song into something very carefree and light, because he doesn't quite read it seriously. And if you read it seriously, it's like, good golly, let's talk about something else. But you know,
yeah, really.
Dean has this sense of you know lightness to him, and yet he could get very serious about, say, country music. He also sang, unlike Sinatra, Dean recorded 2 whole albums of music in Italian. Frank barely ever sang a sentence in Italian. Dean did albums of it. So he had his own thing going on, and I think Frank always respected that about him, that, you know, he would have to go to Dean and ask, whereas, you know, these other people would show up at his door in the morning and was like, you know, can I get your paper? Can I get your coffee? What can I do for you? He had guys like that on his payroll, so he didn't need his friends to be that way.
Right.
And then Dean was the least of that. You know, he'd say, Dean, let's do something. Dean'd say, I don't feel like it. And he'd go up into his hotel room and read comic books or watch a Western on TV. I'm not even joking. He read comic books as a grown man in the 50s and 60s.
Wow.
You know, when it was not like there was no comic book culture, it was like kid stuff. But that was what he liked. And Dean Martin, I've written 8 books. I have mentioned Dean Martin in all of them, even when it's been a stretch, because I think of him as a lucky charm.
Did you say that have you spoken to Jerry Lewis when you were writing this?
Yeah. When I interviewed him,
wow.
I interviewed him twice for the biography that I wrote of him, and it was hair raising.
I can't even imagine what that must have been like. You know.
You know, he's an amazing character, and he's lived an amazing life, but he's not a nice man, and he's not known for being a nice man.
But, you know, I know him from is the telethons, you know, like where he comes off as, you know, the greatest guy ever. So it's interesting, and, you know, but I did hear those stories about him, but, you know.
Yeah, go look at, in December, just this past month, he was interviewed by The Hollywood Reporter. He's in his 90s now, Jerry.
I was going to say, he's still alive.
Yeah, he had a movie release this past year. It was made about 3 years ago. Not very good, but he was decent in it. But look for it's usually billed on YouTube or other media as most awkward interview ever, and it's 7 minutes of Jerry being a complete bastard to some ignorant reporter.
I would definitely look that up.
This guy who I thought was a kid, and then I saw an interview with him, and I was like, this guy's in his 40s or 50s. He's really bad at his job. And Jerry is he's not even trying to hide his contempt for this guy. And at one point, the guy says, you know, you started coming to Vegas in the 40s. How is it different today? And Jerry says, it's exactly the same. And that's it. And then the guy says, what's the same about it? Everything. Well, you know,
okay.
There's nothing the same about Las Vegas today as 70 years ago.
Right.
Just watch the thing. You know, that's the
real
Jerry Lewis.
That's
the real Jerry Lewis. I met that guy.
Interesting. I will definitely go and watch it. Now, I got in the mail yesterday, I ordered your book, Dolce, I don't want to say it wrong. Dolce Vita?
Dolce Vita Confidential, yeah.
Yes. and I plan on reading it. I mean, I hope we can talk about it, because the thing I loved about your writing, and I'm sure you've been told this, but I love the way you end a section or a chapter, or like it's just it keeps it, the story is tight. And when I get to the end of it, I'm like, and I'm reading the next one. Like, I keep thinking, okay, I'm going to get up, and then I'm going to, but you always have it that it leads right into, I mean, it's the smoothest transition, and it just, as a reader, I just love it. And I'm like, I could read anything this guy writes. I don't care who he writes about. I'm just going to read his books.
Well, that's incredibly kind. Yeah,
I'm serious. So I got the I could only get, I guess it's only out in hardcover because
it only came out in October. Yeah,
correct. And
that book I wanted to write right after Rat Pack Confidential. I wanted to write that book in like the year, in 1999, because another reason I was drawn to write about the Rat Pack is that was the last time where adults were the focus of showbiz. Once the Beatles came in '64 and the Rat Pack is kind of over, since 1964, the prime mover of popular culture is teen culture. And that's music, film, fashion. The biggest grossing movies of the year are not grown-up dramas. They're superhero movies or animated films or, sci-fi. It's much more associated with young people. Obviously, the most popular recording stars are since the Beatles have been, acts that appeal to young people. And fashion, people dress, for the last 50 years to look younger. But back in the day, you dressed to look mature and successful and sophisticated. And the Rat Pack were the last guys of the grown-up era to have center stage and be on, the tippy top, before the invasion of the kids. And when I thought about that, for some reason my mind went backwards and to the Dolce Vita era of Rome, where, in my view, for the first time, something like the modern style came into being in men's fashion, filmmaking, the birth of the paparazzi in Rome, which is, a real thing. There were tabloid photographers previously, but never packs of them chasing down celebrities. So I wanted to do that book, but I couldn't get anyone interested. And then 20 years later, I was able to write it. So never give up.
Never give up. I am so looking forward to it, and I hope we can have a conversation about it, because
Sure.
It's always so awesome to be able to ask the questions right to the author, when you're reading it. And but this has been a great conversation, and I just want to thank you so much for this book, and I look forward to reading your next book. And are you working on anything right now that this has come out?
I'm hopefully working on something. I had a bunch of good ideas in 2016, and none of them quite got off the ground. But I just submitted something to my agent yesterday.
Nice.
I'm trying to write basically it's the biography of a famous hotel, a famous showbiz hotel.
Nice.
It opened in the 1920s, and it's still very popular, and it's just sort of like a long story about how the people who are there, and crazy stories about their time there, but also about how, life and culture have changed over those decades, and how it's reflected in this one building's history.
Oh, well, I hope that catches on, because I love reading the history through your eyes. I really do. It's amazing.
Well, thank you.
So, and I will be posting for everybody your link to your website, ShawnLevy.com, and they can see I see you're also a big Twitter guy, right? You like Twitter?
Yeah. Twitter somehow suits my metabolism.
Right.
I'm on Facebook, but only really just to keep up with my family. But on Twitter, I've got all my various passions and rants on display.
Awesome,
Lately,
so they can see those.
Yeah, the people who show up in January at the gym, that's my latest hobby horse. You know, it's like for 3 weeks, you people are going to clog up my gym. Would you just get it over with?
Just get it over with. You're gonna leave by mid-January anyway.
None of you. None of you will be here by Valentine's Day. Would you just please hurry up?
And it's funny because my gym, I was on vacation. I was down in Florida. I came back and I was like, all right, I got to go to the gym. And then I'm like, oh, no, it's going to be a bad day at the gym. I think I'll wait a week or two because, you know, it is when it starts spinning out that you can get back to your normal, you know, routine. So I hear you.
Yeah. Anyway, that's the sort of stuff I'm doing on Twitter. It's not really work-related. It's more shout out the window.
There you go. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and I hope we talk again soon, very soon. I'm going to be starting on this book ASAP, so I will be in touch.
Oh, terrific.
Okay, have a great day. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks. You too.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.